At my mother-in-law's birthday dinner in Rome, my seat was missing. Not the chair itself. There were chairs, crystal, linen, a small army of polished servers, but my place at the table, the one with my name on an embossed tent card, was simply gone. A gap of empty space where my napkin should have folded like an invitation I hadn't been given. The table ran like a ribbon beneath strings of lights, the Colosseum a distant silhouette glowing at dusk. Everyone else had a plate, a glass catching candlelight, a whispered note of expectation. I had nothing. I looked at Eleanor across from the head of the table, at the way she extended her jaw as if to say, without speaking, "We have always known our order." She lifted her hand in a minuet of porcelain and conversation. Sean, fidgeting with his cuff, smiled like a man who'd rehearsed his comforts and never learned the look of contrition. I said, very simply, "Seems I'm not family," and left. It was the kind of line that sounds small out loud, but only because it carries a weight you've been stacking for years. People laughed at first, nervous, surprised laughter, until I walked toward the terrace and the air of the city closed around me with the breath of the Mediterranean. I stood for a moment on the flagstones. The light from the restaurant spilled at my feet like a pool. I could hear forks pattering against plates, a clink of crystal, a murmur of someone telling a joke. Eleanor's party carried on inside as if nothing had ruptured. For 30 minutes, it did. Then the front door opened, and the restaurant manager, Marco, steady, professional, a man I'd spoken with months before while arranging the menu, appeared at the head of the stair. His face was a study in restraint. The room fell quiet like someone had pressed a hand against the world's chest. He said in Italian first, and then haltingly in English, something that I had orchestrated only in the modest terms a planner uses when contracts and guarantees are in place. The event had been canceled. A silence that isn't peaceful, but terrible and thin, descended. You could see the blood leave faces. You could see chandeliers tilt in the collective inhale of people who suddenly understood their clothes, their plates, their gold bracelets meant nothing when the ledger was shown to be emptying. It was a quiet that makes remembrance of every small slight replay like a film you've been trying not to watch. If you love true life comeback stories, subscribe. There's more to this, and I'll take you to the moment everything that had held me in place finally gave way. I want you to understand how I got to that terrace, because that line, "Seems I'm not family," didn't come from nowhere. It arrived on the other end of a long geography of work and generosity, of love and erosion, of being quietly used and quietly diminished. To explain, I have to start, not in Rome, but in a narrow, brick-front office in Boston, where I taught myself how to make things look inevitable. I built elite affairs from a desk in a sunless storefront that smelled of wet wool in the winter and lemon oil in the summer when I finally painted it. I learned how to fold napkins so they whispered, and how to assemble a flower in a way that did not scream for attention, but made the air around it different. I learned to manage vendors the way a conductor manages an orchestra. Firm, clear gestures, the right cue at the right time. Early clients were wedding parties with more hope than budget. Later, they were institutions who wanted to brand themselves as possessing taste and permanence. The Caldwell invitation arrived like a key. Eleanor Caldwell adored statements. She collected them. Silver trays, charcoal portraits, foreign operas interrupted at the right moment by champagne. Sean introduced me at a luncheon in Beacon Hill. He wore the smile of someone whose family had been timed by portraits. He wore vulnerability as a casual accessory. It's vivid now how easily I fell into the cadence they expected of me. Admiration for heritage, deference to ritual, gratitude for being included. He loved the way I could make things happen. I loved that someone who could afford my services wanted to be seen with me. Our wedding was held at a converted factory by the Charles River. white drapery, beeswax candles, my signature peony cascade. Eleanor attended, watched closely, and complimented me with the kind of words that landed like weights. She told me I had an eye, that I knew how to make the room breathe. She invited me to conceive of things beyond the wedding: anniversary dinners, intimate patron events, a gala for her foundation. That praise had a current beneath it. I accepted with the eagerness of someone who saw a path opening. Later, I would realize it was the kind of path that narrowed. You should know what Eleanor was like at first. Polished, a woman forged in the habit of defining success by the curve of a family crest. People thought she was cold because she was precise. What she had been, with a lifetime of practice, was exclusionary. It wasn't dramatic at first. The old money rules come like fog, slow, insistent, shifting the furniture of your self-image to fit a room you were meant to admire, not inhabit. At events, she would introduce me as our planner and sit back, letting the phrase define me in a way it never would at any event where my name was on the card. There were slights, small, surgical, invitations that arrived late, a remark at a luncheon about how the city had changed, implying I'd come from a background that needed polishing. A photograph of our wedding, mine and Sean's, placed among their wedding portraits, yet cropped slightly so that my shoulder became background. Sean would smile and say, "Mother likes her frames symmetrical." I smiled back and learned how to take that as a joke. If you have ever endured that brand of quiet, you know how corrosive it can be. It seeps into the edges of your evenings, coats the dishes you wash, makes compliments taste like barbs. But I was building something at the same time. Elite Affairs grew. We moved from a 2-person armchair office to a real suite with a receptionist who wore heels instead of sensible shoes. I hired a small, fiercely talented team. We handled charity galas, product launches, a high-profile book tour. My clients adored the way I could make people feel seen. I learned to make an entrance feel like a benediction. That competence became my armor, then my lever. Eleanor grew to rely on me. She relied on what I could do with the page and the flower and the narrative. She would ask for invitations that felt like spring in Versailles and expect them by Tuesday. I delivered. She praised me in private. She spoke to me of land and legacy as if I too had an inheritance to manage. Because of my work, she invited me further into their orbit. Because of that same work, they could also weaponize me. Small betrayals started as microeconomics. I'd propose a menu. Someone would later publish a photo and attribute the concept to the family's new consultant. My name would be placed as assistance or vendor when, in the room, I'd imagined myself there as an equal. Sean's sister Melissa, who loved gossip the way some people loved crosswords, once told a mutual friend that I had a good eye for finishing touches. It was meant as compliment wrapped in diminution. Another time, at a fundraiser I produced, the Caldwell family took credit in front of attendees for the concept, leaving me to gather the receipts. It wasn't malicious at first. It was a pattern of appropriation, the family absorbing the shine of things I manufactured while maintaining a social distance that made me grateful for my role and ashamed of wanting more. I rationalized. You make allowances for the eccentricities of the people who buy your life's work. You tell yourself that you are being given access to a world, and access is worth paying for with small pieces of dignity. Then the humiliations grew smarter. Eleanor kept a certain seat for herself at every family lunch. My seat was reserved in principle and moved in practice. At one anniversary dinner, she whispered to the maitre d', so he thought, and my place card was slid down the line until my napkin landed next to a coat rack. Sean noticed and did nothing more than murmur that his mother had always had preferences. I tried to treat it as family eccentricity. Inside, the small aggressions started to look like a map of exclusion. Outside, I continued to make the world look beautiful. A turning point came the winter before Rome. We were in town for a Caldwell charity event that I had produced from concept to closing speech. The gala was a success by every measurable metric: press, donations, applause. I negotiated with a vendor who'd worked in Florence and brought in hand-painted glass for the centerpieces. The night I expected recognition, as the head table cleared its dessert plates, Eleanor pointedly asked the organizer of the museum she supported if he would consider a new director. I had to accept a plated applause that landed on everyone else's shoulders but my own. At home, alone in the studio that doubled as our kitchen, I scrawled invoices and press clippings onto a shoebox. Sean appeared at the doorway, hair rumpled, the sort of late-night presence that is somehow more defeating than absence. He told me he loved me and asked if I'd sign off on a reimbursement. He wanted the files for the next charity. I gave them to him. It felt like lending a book to a roommate. I did not notice how many pages I was giving away. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from giving everything you are at work and being expected to disappear into the background at home. The balance sheet of affection becomes a ledger where credit and recognition are counted in the margins. When I finally started watching for patterns, I noticed that projects with my fingerprints wound up being recast as family endeavors. When I pressed, Sean muttered about helping around the edges and familial contributions. He felt to outsiders like a man trying to keep two lives at the same altitude. I should have seen the first red flag differently. Maybe I did, but the signs were insistent and layered. There were excuses, business trips, a late client call, patterns that explained away the sharpness with which Sean retreated into his family's definition of what he ought to be. Once, on a trip to the countryside, I found a program for an event with my floral installation photographed and credited to a Caldwell aesthetic team. On another occasion, I learned that a vendor I had introduced to Eleanor had been rehired by the family without my involvement and given a retainer I had been promised. It felt like a slow theft carried out by a family that never acknowledged its hands. And beneath all of that lay secrets stranger than petty appropriation. When you stage events for people who are accustomed to preserving appearances, you learn to read ledgers for the fissures people hope will remain invisible. I was trained to notice inconsistency, an invoice with odd line items, a payment to a shell company with a name that meant nothing to me, a bifurcation in a contract that hinted at escrow. Event planning isn't just about table settings, it's about finances. You shepherd deposits, you follow guarantees, you manage escrow accounts for caterers and estates. An admission fee on an invoice can tell you who is controlling access to a project. It is the underside of glamour. In the months before we left for Rome, I began to see these fissures. They appeared like footnotes in a book whose plot I had only just learned to read. There were transfers marked to Caldwell Holdings that bounced across accounts as if passing a baton. There were consultant payments wired to numbered entities. None of this spelled crime in my notebook. It spelled complexity. But complexity is the first cousin of avoidance. If you spend enough nights balancing pages, you get attuned to patterns of obfuscation, the ways people hide shape under a seam. I kept my findings in a folder. I described them to myself as due diligence. There was also Vanessa. You have to see Vanessa as a person before you can see her as a problem. An attractive name in a polite font on a message thread. The kind of woman who shows up in social circles with a laugh that occupies space. She was not an old friend. She was a presence that began to orbit Sean. Text messages at odd hours, a particular insistence in the way Sean's face would shift when his phone buzzed. He called it a colleague, and later a friend. He said it the way a man says something he hopes will sound ordinary. I noticed because I had trained myself to notice strategy and rhythm and composition. I noticed it the way a composer notices a discordant chord. I confronted him once in a way that was more clumsy than courageous. He told me that suspicion shredded what he valued in me, my steadiness, my ability to keep calm. He told me I was jealous, and jealous is a small, tidy assumption people offer when they want to adjust the moral topology of an argument. He told me we were stable, He told me he wanted our life to be secure. I told him that security was not secrecy. He told me he had been traveling more for family commitments. His voice carried an apologetic cadence that felt rehearsed. Rome came as a family trip, Eleanor's birthday, a property they had maintained near Trastevere, a week of what I was told would be delicious work, planning a small dinner that would double as a press moment for the Caldwell Foundation. I packed my dresses in soft tissue paper, the way one folds memory into a suitcase. I made lists for the trip, which is second nature to planners. Shoe pairs, vendor contacts, menus. It felt like a work trip disguised as leisure. Sean was careful that week. He kissed my forehead at check-in like a man who had closed a door. I should have noticed then that he had closed it. We landed in Rome at golden hour. The city looks like a memory when you arrive in late afternoon. The sky caramelizing, the taxi drivers fluent in the kind of charm that markets itself. Eleanor was radiant in her way, her hair a practiced sculpture, her coat draping like a curtain. Richard, her husband, who had been gentle in the way of someone raised with mildness, took my hand in both of his like he was pleased with my presence. Sean introduced me to family friends with a tenderness that made my stomach both drop and swell. If you've ever walked into a room you have staged and felt the grain of your own labor singing beneath your bones, you know a quiet kind of pleasure. I loved the city. I loved seeing the flowers we had chosen when I had styled events with them months ago. This was a life I had curated into small triumphs. I was, in so many ways, the fulcrum beneath a family's social machine. We were there for Eleanor's birthday. I would oversee the flower plan, the toasts, the way the light would fall. On the second evening, as we were turning through the ruins of a palazzo, Sean's phone chimed. He glanced at it and his lips tightened. He tucked the device away under his palm, like a man hiding a small thing inside his fist, as if it were a pebble he didn't intend to speak about. Later, when I reached for his hand at dinner, a sliver of distance had crept into his shoulder blades. He told me in a low voice that there were some family matters he needed to attend to the next morning. I nodded because you nod in the presence of questions you do not yet know how to ask. The first concrete thing I was given was small, an envelope that had been left on my dressing table. Inside was a note in Eleanor's hand, precise and careful. It was a seating plan, I assumed, a sketch of where people would sit. For a planning professional, an existing seating diagram is a thing of solace. It allows you to imagine sight lines and guest flow. I read it at breakfast, imagining linen and place cards, the curve of conversation. Then I noticed that the plan had a space at the far end circled and annotated not with a name, but with the phrase, "Reserved, family discretion." My name was absent from any place. There is a certain, almost comical sturdiness to the way omission is used as punishment. It is a tool that says, without exposing itself to cruelty, that you are less than. I put the plan down. I told myself it was an oversight. That afternoon, in a small hotel office where I had gone to confirm a menu with the chef, my phone buzzed with a text I was not meant to see. Vanessa's name appeared, then a sentence. "We need to talk. Can you meet? It's become complicated." I froze. It was a sentence that had been written in a tense a stranger writes when they are dividing an equation. I scrolled up to see earlier messages. They were polite, notes about a lunch, mentions of mutual acquaintances, but there was an intimacy in the later ones that made my stomach clench. I did not react then. Instead, I opened my laptop, a reflexual defense. I had client emails to answer, a florist to reassure, a caterer to confirm. Romance, betrayal, whatever the word was being made of in those messages, could wait. That is what I told myself. But that night, returning from an appointment at the villa, I found something else. It was an unassuming folder, beige, with a reproduction of a family crest in faint ink. It sat on the sofa where Sean had left it the previous evening. My name reads as someone who would never pry, unless the thing inside was the size of a small mountain. But we are also people who learn to see light through the fog. I opened the folder. What I found were documents that no one in a careful family would misplace. There were notes from an attorney, headings like proposed timeline and draft agreement. Some paragraphs were redacted with legal terms, others were chilling in their frankness. The draft spoke of separation benefits, listed dates that suggested a staged narrative, and included a seating plan that matched the one on my dressing table. There were also, tucked beneath the paper, a printout of a bank statement with multiple lines to small entities. The numbers were not mine to interpret forensically. They were, however, the kind of notation that hints at a financial choreography you are not supposed to read. I did what everyone else would do, what I had often done in my work. I made a copy of the most salient pages and put the originals back where they were. Not because I thought myself heroic in the act, but because I had learned the value of evidence. If you are going to confront a pattern of exclusion and betrayal, you do so with paper in your hand and witnesses on your side. Planners and litigators share a thing in common. We collect things that prove a narrative. There was one more thing in the folder, a message thread printed as though someone had anticipated a future need to prove that words had been said. It was between Sean and a contact I did not recognize, but the tone was intimate and transactional. It mentioned a woman I knew by name, Vanessa, and referenced a timeline and a decision. The language was clinical. It was a conversation that stripped romance of its tenderness and treated people like chapters. When I closed the folder, the room felt smaller. The villa's shutters let between the rooms a wedge of Roman light that seemed too bright for the kind of news I was carrying. I did not confront Sean then. There are many forms of courage. There is also a kind that waits to be certain. I wanted to be certain. Over the next 24 hours, other small shapes formed. A message I discovered, on a device that was left unlocked, mentioned Vanessa's name, alongside a calendar entry marked with a red dot. A draft of a speech intended for Eleanor's charity referenced legacy consolidation and asset protection. These are words families use when they are hyper-conscious of transmission. They are the words you hear when money is less liquid than it used to be and more defensive. If you have been watching ledgers long enough, you see how social capital and financial capital begin to protect themselves with the same guardrails. I was not naive. I had seen families close ranks to protect a brand. What surprised me was the scale of the choreography. This was not simply a family setting a place at the table. This was a family rehearsing a future in which I had no place at all. There was also a smaller, more human thing I found that night. A folded photograph slipped inside the folder like a breadcrumb from a private pantry. It was candid, Sean and Vanessa by a cafe, shoulders close, laughing, the kind of laugh that is captured when people do not yet know their picture will be evidence. In the background, a small shape in Vanessa's silhouette suggested the roundness of a moment not yet announced. My hands went cold as a winter glass. You can start to catalog betrayals in the same guttural way you catalog losses. First, the color of the room goes out, then the sound, then the memory of small personal gestures that had been invested with meaning. I sat on the sofa and felt the whole architecture of my life settle like dust. What you should understand is not that I was shocked in the way of someone who has never been deceived, but that I was impressed by the organization of the deception. It was not slovenly, it was precise. There were documents, there were drafted scripts, there was a seating plan with me missing from the narrative. The thing that made my breath shallow was how competent it all looked, like a production meeting in which the lead had been cut in the script. That night, I slept with the folder on the nightstand. I did not sleep long. I rehearsed questions that had 1,000 tones and no answers. In the morning, when Sean left for a business call, I read through the papers again and took photographs of certain pages with my phone. I did not know what I would do with them. I only knew that evidence must be preserved. I thought of the way I had given myself to the family's events, contracts, correspondence, payment wires, with my company's signature in small legal font. I had set up guarantees, as any event planner does, to protect vendors and clients. I had done it in good faith. I had written emails naming my company as responsible for aspects of service when the family insisted on my expertise. Those documents existed. Contracts remember things people prefer to forget. In the afternoon, when Eleanor asked if I would join her in the garden to review florals, I accepted. She tightened the scarf at her throat in that way that suggested she had always been cold to those she suspected of asking for warmth. We walked among clipped hedges and citrus trees. She offered bitter tea, which she always did when she was preparing to probe. She smiled and said, "Isn't Rome lovely? Everything in its place." The remark landed like a test. "Everything should be in its place," I answered, "because you always answer what people want to test you with." On the way back to the villa, she told me, casually, how proud she was that the family continued to manage its affairs deftly. She praised Sean's attentiveness to estate questions. She did not look at me when she said it. That omission was a kind of hand closing. I left the villa and walked the narrow streets with the folder packed into my bag like a small, dangerous thing. The city smelled of frying garlic and citrus. People talked loud in doorways. I found a cafe and sat with an espresso, watching the way Romans gestured as if the world itself could be persuaded with an index finger. I called no one. I did not know who to call. If anything, the city felt like a stage, and I was pacing behind the curtains. When I returned that evening, Eleanor had prepared dinner for a group that included friends and distant cousins, people who moved through the world with the steady, deflective polish of pedigrees. She asked me for small favors. Could I speak with the caterer? Could I consult on the music? And I complied. The business of my hands calmed me. The work steadied me the way a sea steadies a ship. I answered emails and sent a text to Marco to confirm the restaurant's layout, all the while keeping the folder under my arm like a heart no one else could see. There was a moment when Sean approached me with a softness I had not felt all week. He put a hand on my elbow, and when our eyes met, I said nothing. I did not tell him about the folder. I did not tell him about the photograph or the printed messages. I did not say, "Why is my name missing from the seating?" or "Who is Vanessa?" I only let him stand there for a second, like a man who had leaned against a wall he thought would hold him. You do not always confront betrayal with a shout. Sometimes you wait until you have a script and a stage and witnesses. For me, evidence was the thing that turned suspicion into action. I knew to collect it. I knew to keep it. But the step from keeping to acting is the one that breaks people into new shapes. That night, after the dinner, I opened my laptop in the small study. I typed a list of names, vendors, contracts, accounts where my company held deposits, and, crucially, a list of services booked in my name or Elite Affairs name. Florist deposits, menus I had guaranteed, the venue fee I had personally overseen. I did not include instructions on manipulation or fraud. I wrote only what I knew: dates, contract numbers, emails. There is an austere kind of clarity that comes from making a list of what you own and what you can prove is yours. It felt bureaucratic and righteous at once. I told no one about that list. I encrypted the folder on my hard drive the same way a professional does when guarding client files. I made copies, which is the way you make yourself credible. I put a photocopy of the attorney's draft in a safety envelope and slid it into a locked drawer. Action in my life, when it came, would be built on the architecture of documentation, not on impulse or spectacle. The next morning, the plan for the dinner at Aroma, the restaurant where Eleanor insisted on the caviar paired with a certain vintage, was delivered as if nothing had ever shifted. The sun fell on the Colosseum as it does, indifferent and old. The table was to be set under strings of light, and the band would play a selection of standards Sean liked. Eleanor had prepared a speech. I dressed deliberately, not for performance, but for a test. At the villa, Elena, one of the staff, handed me a list of guests. The list had a neat column, place. My name was not on it. I tucked the folder into my bag and walked to the restaurant and the missing seat. I could have sat down. I could have let the omission slide into another thing I'd swallowed. Instead, I chose a sentence so small it seemed like air. Seems I'm not family. Then I walked out. Standing on the terrace, with Rome humming below and the folder of evidence thudding its steady heartbeat inside my bag, I knew something else was about to begin. The folder was a point of leverage. It was also the edge of a rupture. I had assembled the paper trail. I had noted the deposits my company held that bore my signature. I had copies. I had witnesses. I did not yet know how the family would react when I used that quiet leverage. I did know that when people make long plans of exclusion, they are always built on the assumption that the person they exclude will accept the margin. As the sun went down and the restaurant inside drew breath for Eleanor's toast, I stepped away from the warmth and let the air wash my face. I placed a call to someone I trusted, not to conspire, but to say, in a voice that was steady and without theatrics, that I was ready to stand. I did not yet press the lever I could press. What I did was set the stage so that any action would be anchored in fact, not in rumor. You will have to wait to see how it plays out. There are, as you have already read, many players and many consequences. What I can tell you now is this. The missing chair was not an accident. It was a deliberate exclusion that reflected a longer design. And once you notice a design, you can decide whether to be a piece of its furniture or to take the building plans out of someone else's hands and read them for yourself. I watched Marco walk down the stair and felt the restaurant's air change the way a stage light shifts, sudden, narrow, hot. He paused at the bottom, framed by polished wood and the hush of forks. He spoke in Italian first, then in English, the words deliberate and quiet so that people leaned forward because they had to. I'm sorry, there has been a problem with the arrangements. We cannot serve this event. The room inhaled. Eleanor's smile stiffened into a blade. Conversation stopped mid-air. Someone adjusted a napkin as if to hide a tremor. The band faltered in the background, and a single waiter hovered, unsure whether to do his duty or to disappear. Sean glanced toward the terrace where I was standing, and for a second I saw something like recognition, then panic, the way a bird might look at a window it didn't notice until it struck. Marco did not elaborate. He didn't have to. I had set the terms for him. Months earlier, when I'd negotiated the menu and deposit schedule, I had been explicit about the guarantees necessary to confirm a service of that scale. I had done what planners do. I wrote contingencies into contracts, required confirmations, and insisted on transparency because vendors deserve clarity and clients deserve to be bound to their promises. That day, I asked Marco to verify what he needed to verify. He had done exactly what he said he would, checked the ledgers, compared deposits against invoices, confirmed with the caterer and the wine supplier, and then, the way professionals protect their reputation and their teams, he paused their performance. There is a certain theater to a room losing its function. It was not chaos. It was arithmetic becoming social sanction. Theo, the sommelier, pressed his hands flat on the linen as though to steady himself. A woman in pearls began to cry, the kind of small, atypical sound made by people who realize a surface they had trusted was only lacquer. Eleanor rose like someone who had rehearsed indignation, a lift of chin, a rearrangement of coat. She asked Marco for an explanation. He, with the tact I had taught him to expect in contract work, produced an email printed on restaurant letterhead. Payments pending, services on hold pending confirmation of funds. You could see the story arrive on people's faces, in frames, shut mouths, narrowed eyes. Someone in the corner reached for their phone. I had not wanted spectacle. I had wanted facts. Facts arrived in the precise, stubborn form they always do: paperwork, names, numbers. It was the ledger that made the room small and the family's facade porous. Sean tried to intercept Marco. "Marco, this is a mistake. We arranged everything." His voice was papery, the tone a man uses when the script he relied on suddenly loses a page. Marco produced his own copy of the deposit confirmations and the contract. He showed the sequence of emails confirming designs, then the most recent correspondence noting that funds had not cleared. He said, "I acted in good faith for everyone. Without payment, I cannot ask my team to serve." Eleanor's eyes snapped to me then, and I knew what she wanted. An explanation framed as betrayal, the story that I had engineered a spectacle out of spite. There was no thunder in my reply. I stepped toward the doorway and into the orbit of the table. Close enough to be heard, not close enough to be confrontational. "I didn't create the problem," I said. "I documented it." Silence tends to solidify in wealthy rooms because silence preserves gaudiness. The silence broke with a phone buzz. Sean's phone, with an agitated message, then another, then an incoming call he refused. He turned toward me and found nothing to say that encompassed the drafts and the photographs and the paper I'd saved. His mouth made the motions of apology without deciding on a tone. "This is embarrassing," Eleanor offered in a voice that had not yet learned the vocabulary of accountability. "Marco, can't you?" Marco, whose loyalty to good work outweighed his loyalty to false comfort, shook his head. A caterer at the back of the room, whom I had worked with before and who respected the sanctity of clear payment, stepped forward and asked to speak privately with Marco. Two men in black aprons exchanged a look. A party planned to run on a timeline requires people who can rely on compensation as much as on choreography. Without confirmation, the team simply wouldn't perform. The guests began to murmur. A cousin I had never met, rosy in the cheeks from Prosecco, said, "Is this some kind of joke?" Somebody captured the moment on a phone. In the first place, no one realized how quickly the smallest human acts turn into documentation. Within minutes, the Italian waiter from the entrance was recording because in the age of social media, people preserve what they witness as if it were archaeology. The clip went from hand to hand in the room and then out into the world, as if someone had opened a window in a house where secrets were kept. Sean's first instinct was the usual male instinct of avoidance. He asked me, in a low voice that trembled now with fear rather than control, "You did this?" It was not a question so much as a plea. I met him without theatrics. "I put what I had," I said. "I asked the vendors to honor the contracts they signed and to stop work when payment was not confirmed. That is what professionals do." It was the kind of line people like us use to make an argument moral and dull. Professionals are faithful to paperwork, not to spats. But in the room, the line read as revelation. It read as an assertion that the family's wealth was not as fluid as it seemed, that a failure to fund an event meant more than a temporary oversight. When a foundation delays a grant, questions begin to follow. When vendors are left waiting, reputations are at stake. The guests who had come to glow in Eleanor's reflected light felt that light die in a way they could not understand. They had assumed the family's resources were a steady current. Tonight, that current showed eddies. Eleanor's face changed in ways I had not seen before. First a flush, then a puzzlement, then the slow, artful composure of a woman deciding what to do when her script no longer works. She asked to see her accounts, demanded that a staff member produce receipts, and insisted that Richard call the estate manager. The staff moved like trained dancers of denial. An argument began to circle, whether the issue was bank error, a hold on a wire, a fraud alert. No story settles until someone produces a simple, authoritative statement that pushes speculation back into the box of fact. No one in the room had that statement. Sean's jaw clenched. He made a show of stepping away to call his banker. He dialed with a hand that trembled. He asked everyone to be patient. He said, desperately, "We can sort this out." Sean had always been the practiced son, the man who could recite a family narrative without questioning the source of the words. That night, he stood naked in the language of contingency, and it did not serve him. As the room thinned with people leaving, some to get fresh air, some to text their chauffeurs, Eleanor arranged herself like a commander calling for explanations. Her voice became the one she had used to issue small social commands for decades. "Someone will pay this," she said, as if money were a thing that could be willed back into being by insistence. She asked me point blank whether I had distributed this information, whether I had contacted any press. I held her gaze. "I gave what I had," I said. "I gave the contracts and the confirmations. People are entitled to the truth." It was not an exacting confession of revenge. It was not a proclamation of triumph. It was a statement of fact. That is what I had always insisted on, that truth and documentation matter more than a single theater of outrage. In that room, the two proved decisive. From then on, events moved with the steady, surreal logic of crisis. A guest tweeted a brief video, just 30 seconds of a man in a tuxedo standing by an empty set where a chair should have been. In the caption, someone added a short sentence about the dinner being called off, and within an hour, a blogger in Rome pieced together the story. The Caldwell name, once a private shield, became a headline. A local reporter called the restaurant to confirm, then called the estate manager, then called the foundation. The story slid from gossip to coverage because the ledger gave it gravity. When your narrative is corroborated by paper, you are harder to ignore. Back at the villa, things unraveled differently. The household called their attorney. The attorney, a man who had always been excellent at consequences and at the art of postponement, sent messages that were precise and defensive. He accused me by implication of orchestrating a spectacle. His tone suggested that he believed in the power of accusation to intimidate someone into silence. He asked for all communication to cease and implied legal action. I forwarded his note to my own lawyer, who wrote back not with threats, but with measured queries. "Show me the contracts. Show me the deposits. Tell me what you have." A reasonable approach, because in life, the best defense is clarity, and the best counter is the truth. Sean called me at dusk, voice raw. "Anna, this is getting out of hand." He asked me to meet him. He asked me to explain. I told him to speak honestly, to tell me if I had misread everything. He said, "There are arrangements. There are things you don't understand." He sounded like the man who had been raised to let some truths remain categorically unspoken. I told him calmly that I did understand enough, that there were documents, that there were photographs, that there were texts, and that I would not be herded into silence. He did not know how to be brave in that moment, and so he chose a lesser option. He asked for time. In the weeks that followed, the Caldwell household performed crisis management in the way institutions do. Statements of intent, carefully worded denials, an offer to postpone the celebration until a later date that sounded more like a public relations maneuver than an admission. Vendors began to call for payment when the first invoices failed to reconcile. The foundation postponed a gala with a terse note about reorganization. A few donors asked questions in private. The papers ran columns, social feeds parsed the optics. My own life pivoted into motions I had anticipated in a professional sense, but not in the personal. Lawyers, meetings, inventory audits of what documents I had and what I needed. I had been careful enough to keep copies and careful enough to ensure that emails were archived and not scattered. I had been prudent enough to consult a lawyer before I took any public step. Prudence is not the same thing as vindictiveness. It is, in this world, a form of survival for people whose work leaves them exposed to reputational harm. There were loud noises at first, angry emails, threats of suit, a demand from Eleanor that I return family property, a phrase that always read oddly because it assumed people could hand back the agency of another human. Sean oscillated between apology and avoidance. Some days he called, leaving messages that vacillated from panicked to pleading. On the phone, he would say things like, "We can fix this," and then hang up as if the sentence had betrayed him into truth. Then, quietly, he stopped answering. I filed for separation. It was a strange administrative act, the filling of forms, the assembling of bank statements, the naming of assets. In that legal landscape, I felt oddly unembarrassed. There is a relief in naming what you will no longer accept. My counsel advised discretion. They also advised tenacity. We did not flaunt, we documented. We negotiated the messy arithmetic of what had been joint and what had been mine. Eleanor's attorneys suggested arbitration, then threatened litigation. I did not enjoy the legal theater, but I embraced the clarity that it required. The Caldwell family tried to control the narrative. They distributed a statement to the press claiming a banking error and that the event had been postponed due to a misunderstanding. It was the reasonable thing to say when you want to quiet a storm. But when vendors posted statements that contradicted the bank error story, notes about unpaid invoices, about pending deliveries, about work that had already incurred cost, the ground thickened. A foundation's liquidity is not a private matter when suppliers begin to publish their grievances. The story mutated from a social slight into a financial inquiry. It would have been easy, in another life, to let people decide my role: the scorned wife, the conniving planner, the social climber who mistook hospitality for membership. The ease of typecasting life into tidy roles is why families keep their scripts. I refused that ease because I had the receipts. I had a folder that explained, in the blunt grammar of paper, how a family rehearsed a version of the future without me. That folder was not the instrument of revenge, it was the instrument of protection. It turned rumor into something courts could interrogate and journalists could not dismiss. Months went by. There were legal exchanges and private settlements over small, bitter things. There were press cycles that came and went. A few close friends called in tears, others in anger. Former clients wrote notes of support. Some clients worried about association. Others appreciated the clarity of agency I emanated. Elite Affairs weathered the storm because I had protected contracts and because my team, resilient and brilliant, refused to be shamed for having their labor exploited. Our phones rang more than they had in years, ironically. People wanted to be associated with someone who had not only an eye for beauty, but a spine for reality. There is a market, it seems, for integrity. Sean tried, eventually, to negotiate a quiet separation. He offered the kind of assurances men in his position offer: promises, intent, vague gestures toward change. I listened, but I did not mistake his wishes for willingness. In private, he admitted he had not intended for things to blow up like this. He said he had been afraid, and that secrecy had felt like safety. I asked myself if a man who desires safety by means of secrecy is a man I can build a life with. I had an answer that was not cruel. No. The divorce was not a spectacle. It was a drainage of shared illusions. There were arguments over small things: whose art belonged where, which contracts had been executed by whom. There were quieter decisions that were not litigated because common sense and counsel prevailed. I did not extract vindictive terms. I extracted what the law allowed and what my conscience permitted. I walked away with my company, with my dignity, and with a drawer of evidence that I felt no shame about possessing. People framed this as revenge. I framed it as reclamation. In the months after, life tasted different. There was less of the numbing exhaustion that had come with constantly managing other people's narratives. I worked long days with my small team. We staged events that were quieter but truer to the people we served. We focused on craft and on clients who wanted the work to be beautiful and honest. The press that had once circled the Caldwell name moved on to other stories. Sometimes I'd read a piece about them and feel nothing but the strange floating sense of distance people feel when they are finally where they had been walking toward all along. There were, certainly, moments of awkwardness. I received a message from Eleanor months later, a brief, brittle note asking if I would consider consulting to help restore reputation management. It read like an offer wrapped in the armor of entitlement, the expectation that she could call and purchase the right to erase what she had already done. I replied with a single sentence. I thanked her for thinking of me and wrote that I wished her well. I declined. The refusal felt small and enormous at the same time. It was a closure that required no gloating. On a cool afternoon several months after the Rome dinner, I sat on a terrace overlooking the Amalfi Coast. The ocean was a vast, sensible blue, stretching into things that did not care about family names. A bottle of wine chilled at my elbow. My phone had rested against my palm for most of the day. My business was humming in the background. My team had just closed on a project that felt like redemption purely because it was honest. I raised a glass to nothing in particular, no person, no victory, and the light caught the surface and painted a thin way across the liquid. I thought of the missing chair in Rome, not as a wound, but as a map. It had shown me where I did and didn't belong, and more importantly, it had shown me what I would no longer accept. The chair had been intended as exclusion. It had turned, somehow, into clarity. People often ask, as if curious about a moral rule, whether the act of exposing a lie is itself a kind of violence. I would answer now that truth, when it is used to guard dignity and to protect others from being erased, is not violence, but physics. It is the way the world settles when a weight is lifted. Business picked up in a cadence I could taste. Word of mouth, surprising, gratifying, and utterly human, brought clients who admired the way I handled both the aesthetic and the ethical decisions. I taught my team to hold both their art and their boundaries with the same firmness. From dishwashers to artisans, people appreciated when their work was treated as more than a prop. There is power in that simple decency. Sometimes I hear of Eleanor in society columns. She moved her foundation into quieter waters for a while. The estate had to renegotiate certain lines of credit. Donations became more difficult as donors asked questions. I was not interested in spectacular ruin. I had no appetite for watching people fall apart. The point had never been to break anyone. It had been to stop being broken. When a former Franklin Street client asked me to produce an anniversary party, I did it with the quiet joy of someone who knows how to set a table that invites people to be themselves. When a staff member from the villa called to say she had found work with a small firm in Tuscany, I felt pleased in that particular way that has nothing to do with triumph and everything to do with justice, practical, human, small. If you are listening because you have been the person whose place was simply moved to the margins, I will tell you what I learned without theatricalism. Name what you own, document it, and do not let public impressions be a substitute for private reality. And when confrontation comes, be ready to speak the truth in a voice that does not require you to shout. There is a restraint that can feel like power because it is simply the refusal to be reduced to someone else's story. The missing chair in Rome taught me to take up space that was mine. It taught me to see the architecture of exclusion for what it is, a plan that assumes compliance. It also taught me something else. Competence is not a shield that merely defends. It is a tool that can make consequences legible. When people behave as if their privileges are eternal, they forget that contracts and reputations are fragile things. In the end, the revenge the title promised was less about spectacle and more about consequence. The evening stopped. The family's private ledger became public question. Negotiations took place. Vows dissolved. It was, by most accounts, epic only in how quiet it was. How a small, precise act of documentation and professional boundary setting could bring the myth of permanence to a halt. I did not celebrate their collapse. I acknowledged it with the coolness of someone who had been prepared for what facts do when they meet people. That night on the Amalfi Terrace, I toasted the empty chair because it reminded me to choose where I belonged by my own standards, not by someone else's invitation. I raised my glass to the people who taught me my craft, to the vendors who honored contracts, to my team who stayed when things got hard, and to the quiet, stubborn fact of dignity. The wine tasted honest. The air smelt of citrus and salt. The world felt larger than it had weeks before. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to reassert your place at the table, share your experience in the comments. Like and subscribe for more true life comebacks.